Everyone thinks Rick Sanchez feels nothing at all. He drinks, he jokes, he shrugs off death like it's nothing. Fans call it genius. Fans call it comedy. His own therapist called it something else completely. And if you've ever felt numb yourself, that difference is exactly why this video is worth watching. The day Rick Sanchez stopped feeling anything. Rick Sanchez is the smartest character in the history of Adult Swim's Rick and Morty, a show created by Justin Roiland and Dan Harmon. He can build a working portal gun, cure diseases in an afternoon, and talk his way out of situations that would kill anyone else in seconds. Fans have spent years laughing at his jokes and quoting his catchphrases. But underneath the science and the sarcasm sits a man who spent decades of his life feeling almost nothing at all. To understand why Rick acts the way he does, and why so many viewers connect his numbness to their own, the story has to start at the one moment that broke him before the show even began. Long before Rick Sanchez became the grandfather bouncing between dimensions with Morty, he was a much younger scientist working on early teleportation research. He was not chasing fame or fighting galactic wars yet. He had a wife named Diane and a daughter named Beth, and by most accounts inside the show, this version of his life was calm. He was building towards something big, in his own lab, in his own dimension, on his own time, without the chaos that fans now associate with him. This period barely gets any screen time across the whole series, which is part of why it stayed a mystery for so long. But small pieces of it eventually made their way into the story, and each piece added more weight to what came next. At some point during this quieter stretch of his life, Rick was approached by another version of himself from a different dimension. This other Rick was already living the kind of life the show's Rick would later become known for, one built around jumping between universes and chasing endless discovery without any interest in settling down. This other Rick tried to convince young Rick to abandon his research path and build his own means of traveling between dimensions, so the two of them could explore the multiverse together. It was framed as an invitation, one scientist reaching out to another version of himself, offering him a bigger life outside the walls of his lab and his house. Rick said no. He was not interested in giving up the life he already had. He had Diane. He had Beth. He had a direction he was building toward on his own terms, and none of it involved joining a stranger who happened to share his face and his voice. This decision might sound small on its own, a single conversation between two versions of the same man, but it turned out to be the most important choice Rick ever made, because of how the other Rick responded to being turned down. The other Rick did not take rejection well. Instead of walking away, he came back with a bomb. He sent it through a portal into Rick's garage, the same room where all of his early scientific work was happening, the same space that should have been the safest place in his life. The explosion tore through the house. Diane was there. Beth, still just a child at the time, was there too. Both of them were killed in the blast, in the same building where Rick had spent years quietly building a future for his family. For years, fans of the show only had a small window into this event, and even that window came with a warning label attached. The scene first appeared during the Season 3 premiere, an episode called The Rick Shank Redemption, which aired in 2017. In that episode, the Galactic Federation had captured Rick and was using a machine to dig through his memories, trying to find the secret behind his portal technology. As the memory of Diane and Beth's deaths played out on screen for the audience, Rick, watching his own memory being read in real time, immediately said the whole thing was made up. He called it a totally fabricated backstory, a story he had planted in his own mind on purpose to throw off anyone trying to read him. For a long time, that denial worked exactly the way Rick wanted it to. Fans debated for years whether Diane had ever existed at all, whether she had a different name, whether she was even real, or whether the entire flashback was nothing more than a trick designed to protect the actual truth, whatever that truth turned out to be. The uncertainty dragged on through multiple seasons. Rick almost never mentioned Diane by name. When the topic came up at all, he shut it down fast, usually with anger or deflection, which only added to the mystery instead of solving it. Then, in an episode called Mort Dinner, Rick Andre, a side character named Mr. Nimbus casually referenced Diane as if her existence was already an accepted fact. Rick reacted with real anger, snapping at Nimbus for what he called establishing canonical backstory, a comment that worked almost like a joke aimed directly at the audience watching at home. But underneath the joke was a quiet confirmation. If Rick was that upset about someone casually confirming details about Diane, it meant there was something real underneath all the denial. The full truth did not arrive until the Season 5 finale, an episode called Rick Mirai Jack, which aired in 2021. That episode confirmed what many fans had suspected for years. The backstory, shown in the Rick Shank Redemption, was true. Diane and Beth really did exist. They really were killed by a bomb sent through a portal by another version of Rick. The only part of the story Rick had actually faked was smaller than anyone expected. He had not lied about their deaths. He had lied lied about how he built his portal technology afterward, using the fabricated version of events to protect the real method he used to crack interdimensional travel, keeping that one detail hidden from anyone trying to steal it from his mind. Everything about the grief, the loss, and the reason he became who he is stayed completely real the entire time. Once the deaths were confirmed as canon, the show slowly started filling in what happened to Rick immediately afterward. An episode called Solarix revealed that at some point in the years following the bombing, Rick built an artificial version of Diane, a kind of computer program designed to sound like her voice, calling to him from another room in his old house back in his home dimension. This AI Diane was not a comfort. It was built to remind him constantly of his failure to protect her and to keep pushing him toward revenge against the Rick who killed her. Rick kept this AI running for years, alone in an empty house, talking to a voice built entirely out of grief and guilt, long after the real Diane was gone. Eventually, Rick returned to that old house after an accident with his portal fluid sent him back to his original dimension. He faced the AI Diane again and told it he was finally ready to move on, since he now had a different family to take care of in a different part of the multiverse. The AI immediately pushed back, using pure logic against him, pointing out that if the same accident that reset his portal fluid had happened once, then the exact same accident could have reset the man who killed Diane in the first place, meaning Rick's search for justice might not even be over. It was a strange and cold argument coming from a machine built to sound like his dead wife, but it worked exactly the way it was designed to work, keeping Rick tied to his past instead of letting him fully close that door. Season 7 added one more piece of this puzzle in an episode called Unmortrican. In that episode, Evil Morty ran a scan on Rick's brain to try to track down the Rick responsible for the bombing, a Rick the show eventually named directly as Rick Prime. The scan gave the clearest version yet of what happened during that original conversation between the two Ricks, confirming the offer to travel the multiverse together, the refusal, and the bombing that followed. It also revealed something the show had not shown before. Rick Prime did not stop after that one bombing. He built a device called the Omega device, a weapon powerful enough to erase every version of Diane across the entire multiverse, not just the one Rick had lost. This meant the woman Rick had spent years trying to move past was not just gone from his own dimension, she was gone from almost everywhere, in almost every version of reality that existed, all because of one man's decision to punish Rick for saying no to him. What makes this origin point so different from a typical tragic backstory is how long the show made everyone wait to know it was real. Most shows reveal a character's core wound early, then spend the rest of the series building on top of it. Rick and Morty did the opposite. It let audiences laugh along with Rick's jokes and chaos for years, without confirming that underneath all of it sat a man whose wife and daughter were murdered because he chose family over ambition. Every joke, every reckless stunt, every moment where Rick seemed to care about nothing had this single event sitting quietly underneath it the entire time, waiting to be confirmed. This is where the numbness begins. Losing a spouse and a child in an instant, inside your own home, in the one room you thought was safe, is the kind of event most people never fully recover from. Rick did not get grief counseling. He did not get support from friends or family who understood what happened, because for years he barely let anyone else know the truth at all. He built a machine to remind himself of the pain instead of finding a way to heal from it. He turned his loss into a decades-long hunt for revenge, chasing one man across an entire multiverse, using his grief as fuel for research instead of letting himself actually feel it. That choice, made in the earliest days after the bombing, set the pattern for almost everything Rick does for the rest of his life. Feeling nothing became easier than feeling everything, and once that pattern locked in, it became the version of Rick the audience has known this entire time. It also explains why Rick reacts so strongly whenever anyone gets close to the topic. The anger he shows when Nimbus casually mentions Diane, the way he shuts down any real conversation about his past, the years spent insisting his own memory was fake. None of it comes from nothing. A person who has fully processed a painful memory does not usually explode when someone brings it up in passing. Someone who has buried that memory under decades of distraction, invention, and forced detachment reacts exactly the way Rick does, defensive and sharp, because the wound never actually closed. It just got covered up with enough noise and chaos that it looked closed from the outside. There is also something worth noticing in the choice Rick made before any of this happened. He was offered a life of pure exploration, no responsibility, no family, nothing holding him down, and he turned it down because he wanted to stay with Diane and Beth instead. The man who eventually became known across the multiverse for chaos and detachment started out choosing the opposite. He chose a quiet life with people he loved over unlimited freedom. That single decision is the reason the bombing happened at all, since Rick Prime only attacked because Rick refused his offer. In a strange way, the version of Rick fans meet in the actual show, the one who avoids attachment and treats most relationships relationships as disposable only exists because the original Rick tried to hold on to attachment as hard as he could and lost everything because of it. This sets up a pattern that will keep showing up across every version of Rick's story worth examining. A man capable of solving almost any scientific problem in existence could not solve the one problem that mattered most to him, and instead of sitting with that failure, he buried it under science, distraction, and eventually full-blown avoidance of anything that looked like real emotional processing. That avoidance did not start small. It started with an AI built specifically to keep the wound open instead of letting it heal, and it only grew from there into other coping methods that fans have watched play out across the entire series. None of this makes Rick's later behavior admirable. Building a machine designed to trap yourself in guilt is not a healthy response to grief, and neither is turning a personal tragedy into decades of violence aimed at tracking down one man across infinite realities. But it does explain where the numbness came from, and why it never really left. The version of Rick who laughs at danger, dismisses feelings, and treats most people as replaceable did not start out that way. He started out as someone who lost the two people he cared about most, in the one moment he thought he was finally safe, and never found a real way to process it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next place this pattern shows up is not in some distant part of the multiverse or some tragic flashback. It shows up right inside Rick's own kitchen table, during an ordinary attempt at family therapy that Rick will do almost anything to avoid, including turning himself into something no one in his family expects. Section 2. Why Rick turned into a pickle instead of talking. Rick Sanchez has faced armies, gods, and entire governments across the multiverse without blinking. But one of the few things that has ever made him panic enough to alter his own body on purpose was a single hour of scheduled family therapy. This moment happened in an episode called Pickle Rick, the third episode of Season 3, which first aired on August 6, 2017. It became one of the most talked about episodes in the entire history of the show, and it also gave fans one of the clearest looks yet at exactly how far Rick will go to avoid sitting still with his own feelings. The setup is simple on the surface. Beth, Morty, and Summer are getting ready to leave for a family counseling session. This session is part of a larger storyline running through the whole season, tied to Beth and Jerry's separation and the strain it has placed on the entire household. Morty goes to get Rick so the family can head out together, and instead of finding his grandfather ready to go, he finds a pickle sitting in the garage. Rick has turned himself into a pickle, entirely on purpose, specifically so he has an excuse to skip the appointment. This was not an accident or a side effect of some other experiment gone wrong. Rick built the transformation with a plan already in place. He intended to sit in the garage as a pickle for the exact length of the therapy session, then use a syringe filled with a serum that would turn him back into his normal human form once the coast was clear. The entire stunt was designed so that he would never actually have to speak to a therapist, face any questions about his behavior, or explain anything about his relationship with his family. He would simply disappear from the situation in the strangest way possible, wait it out, and return to being Rick once nobody needed him to sit in a room and talk about his feelings. The plan fell apart almost immediately, and not because of any outside interference. Beth, frustrated with her father's decision to dodge the session entirely, picked up the syringe that was meant to turn him back and brought it with her to therapy instead of leaving it behind. This left Rick stuck as a pickle with no way to change back on his own. Shortly after, a rainstorm hit the garage, and Rick, with no way to move on his own power, was washed out through a drain and into the sewer system beneath the house. What happened next turned into one of the most extreme survival sequences the show has ever produced, and almost none of it would have been necessary if Rick had simply gone to therapy in the first place. Trapped in the sewer with no limbs and no way to call for help, Rick used his own scientific knowledge to build himself a new body out of dead rats. He tore into fresh rat carcasses, wired their nerves and muscles into a working exoskeleton, and used the resulting rat-powered body to move, fight, and eventually escape the sewer entirely. Along the way, he also took control of a cockroach by attaching himself to its severed head, using its body as a temporary vehicle to travel through narrow spaces no rat body could fit through. Once free of the sewer, Rick ended up inside a heavily guarded compound run by armed agents, the kind of facility built for high-level government or intelligence work. Still in pickle form, riding around inside a body built from rat parts, Rick fought his way through dozens of armed guards, using weapons built from whatever office supplies and scrap material he could find inside the building. The compound's director eventually sent in a captured fighter named Jaguar, played by guest actor Danny Trejo, to finish Rick off. Instead of finishing the fight, Rick convinced Jaguar to team up up with him. The director had been holding Jaguar's daughter hostage to force his cooperation, and once Rick learned this, the two of them worked together to escape the compound by helicopter, setting explosives to destroy the building on their way out. While all of this violence and chaos was happening underground and inside a foreign compound, an entirely different kind of confrontation was unfolding back at the therapist's office. Beth, Morty, and Summer sat down for their scheduled session with Dr. Wong, played by guest actor Susan Sarandon, without Rick there to interrupt or redirect the conversation. Dr. Wong steered the discussion toward the real reason the family had come in, which had less to do with Rick's disappearing act and more to do with the divorce between Beth and Jerry, and how each of the children were processing it. Morty and Summer both expressed frustration about the situation at home, and Dr. Wong worked to keep the session focused on their feelings, rather than letting the conversation drift back toward Rick, even though the pickle stunt kept pulling everyone's attention in that direction anyway. At one point, Dr. Wong pressed Beth directly about her relationship with her father, and Beth admitted something that mattered far more than anything happening in the sewer chase. She said she admired Rick, specifically because he does not need anyone. This single line, spoken calmly in a therapist's office while her father was somewhere else fighting for his life as a vegetable with rat limbs, captured the entire emotional core of the episode. Beth was not just describing her father. She was describing the trait in him that she wanted for herself, the ability to feel nothing, need nothing, and depend on no one. Dr. Wong picked up on this immediately and pointed out that this admiration was not healthy and that it was shaping how Beth raised her own children and how she viewed emotional connection in general. Eventually, Rick made his way back to the therapy office, still covered in blood and sewer filth, still trapped in pickle form, arriving just as the session was wrapping up. Beth handed over the syringe, and Rick used it to turn back into his human body, with the transformation happening off-screen as the family drove home together. Before they arrived home, Rick apologized to Beth, not for turning himself into a pickle, but specifically for lying about it being an accident earlier in the episode. It was a small, quiet moment buried at the end of an incredibly loud and violent hour of television, and it was as close as Rick came to admitting any kind of fault the entire episode. During the confrontation inside Dr. Wong's office near the end of the episode, Rick delivered one of the most quoted explanations of his own worldview in the entire show. He explained that he does not respect therapy, and that as a scientist, his job is to invent, transform, create, and destroy, and that whenever something about the world bothers him, he simply changes it himself instead of talking about it. He argued that sitting in a rented office, listening to someone explain which words match which feelings, has never actually helped anyone accomplish anything meaningful. He admitted it probably helps people feel calmer and stop panicking, but he compared that calm state to the kind of docile comfort people expect from farm animals, not something he wants for himself. He closed the thought by saying he is not a cow, he is a pickle when he feels like it. This speech sounds like classic Rick bravado on the surface, funny, arrogant, and delivered with total confidence. But the content of what he is actually saying lines up perfectly with everything the pickle stunt already proved about him. Rick would rather manufacture an entire life-threatening survival mission, complete with dead rats, armed guards, and explosions, than sit calmly in a room and describe how he feels. Violence, invention, and danger are comfortable territory for him. Ordinary emotional honesty is not. He chose to build weapons out of office supplies and fight through dozens of armed men rather than answer a therapist's questions about his family, and by his own explanation, that was not an accident of circumstance. It was closer to a philosophy. Critics and fans who studied the episode closely have pointed out that this pattern fits a recognizable behavior. Rather than face a smaller, quieter form of conflict, the kind involving feelings, blame, and vulnerability, Rick manufactures a louder, more dangerous form of conflict instead, one where the stakes are life and death, but the emotional risk is close to zero. Fighting armed guards as a pickle carries real physical danger, but it carries none of the danger that comes with sitting across from a therapist and being asked why he acts the way he does. Physical danger, no matter how extreme, was still safer to Rick than emotional exposure. This same pattern connects directly back to what happened to Rick decades earlier, when Diane and Beth were killed. Facing that loss directly, processing it, grieving it, and eventually moving past it would have required exactly the kind of emotional work Rick avoids at every opportunity. Instead, he built a machine to keep the wound open and spent years chasing revenge across the multiverse. The pickle stunt is a smaller, more comedic version of the exact same instinct. Given a choice between an enormous, dangerous, chaotic external mission and a quiet internal reckoning, Rick will pick the external mission every single time, even when the external mission involves murdering rats and hijacking a helicopter. The episode also reveals something about how this pattern spreads beyond Rick himself. Beth's comment about admiring her father for not needing anyone shows that this coping style did not stay contained to one person. Beth grew up watching her father handle pain by refusing to depend on anyone else, and she absorbed that same instinct as something worth aspiring to, rather than something worth questioning. Dr. Wong's response in the room made it clear this was not a healthy trait to admire, but the fact that Beth admired it at all shows how deeply this pattern had already shaped the family long before the pickle stunt ever happened. There is also something worth noting in how casually the show treats the entire ordeal once it is over. Rick does not go through any kind of visible change by the end of the episode. He does not decide therapy is worth trying again, and neither does the rest of the family in any lasting way. In fact, on the drive home, when Summer and Morty ask whether they will keep going to therapy, Beth and Rick brush the question aside and decide to go get a drink together instead. The entire, brutal, high-stakes adventure changed nothing about the family's actual willingness to deal with their problems directly. Rick avoided one session through extreme measures, and the family's response to seeing exactly how far he was willing to go was to quietly let the subject drop. Pickle Rick went on to win the 2018 Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program, becoming the first Emmy win in the show's history, and it remains one of the most recognized episodes among casual viewers who may not follow the series closely otherwise. Much of that popularity comes from the sheer absurdity of the premise and the technical skill behind the animation of Rick's rat-powered body fighting through armed guards. But underneath the spectacle, the episode also stands as one of the clearest, most direct examples the show has ever given of exactly how Rick handles emotional pressure. He does not confront it. He escapes it, disguises it, or fights his way past it, using every ounce of his intelligence to avoid the one thing a normal conversation might have solved in an hour. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This gap between what Rick is capable of and what he actually chooses to do becomes even more interesting once his intelligence is placed side by side with his emotional avoidance. He built a working weapon out of office supplies in under an hour. He turned dead rats into a mobile combat body without any prior planning. He is, by every measure the show gives him, one of the smartest individuals in the entire multiverse. And yet all of that raw ability could not get him through a single hour of talking honestly about his own feelings, something most people manage to do without inventing anything at all. Section 3. The smartest man in the universe still couldn't fix himself. Rick Sanchez has cured diseases in minutes, built working spaceships out of household junk, and traveled to more dimensions than most fictional characters even know exist. By almost every measure the show gives him, he stands as one of the most capable minds in the entire multiverse. Yet one of the clearest moments in the whole series shows that same brilliant mind choosing to walk away from a broken world instead of fixing it, simply because walking away was easier than facing what he had done. That moment happened in an episode called Rick Potion Number 9, and it says more about the gap between Rick's genius and his emotional habits than almost anything else in the show. Rick Potion Number 9 is the 6th episode of the very first season, and it aired on January 27, 2014. It was written by Justin Roiland, who also voices both Rick and Morty, and directed by Steven Sandoval. The story starts small. Morty has a crush on a classmate named Jessica, and with a school dance coming up, he asks Rick to make him a love potion so Jessica will notice him. Rick agrees, mixing together a serum made from a mole-like animal called a vole. Morty slips the potion to Jessica, not realizing she already has the flu at the time. The mistake turns catastrophic almost instantly. The love serum latches onto the flu virus already inside Jessica's body and becomes airborne, spreading across the entire planet within minutes. Within a very short amount of time, nearly every human being on Earth becomes infected, and instead of simply falling in love with Morty the way the serum intended, the virus mutates people into horrifying, monstrous creatures. These creatures come to be known throughout the fandom as Cronenbergs, a nickname inspired by a filmmaker famous for movies involving extreme body horror. Within a single episode, almost the entire population of Earth is transformed into something no longer recognizably human. Faced with a planet full of monsters, created directly because of a favor he agreed to do for his own grandson, Rick has a choice to make. He could try to reverse the mutation, he could attempt to study the virus and develop some kind of cure. Given everything the show has already established about his scientific ability, it is reasonable to assume he could have found some way to at least attempt a fix. Instead, Rick decides the situation is simply not worth solving. He tells Morty there is nothing that can be done about the disaster they created, and that thinking about it further will not help anyone. Rather Rather than repair the damage, Rick uses his access to the wider multiverse to search for a different solution entirely. He scans through countless other versions of Earth until he finds one nearly identical to their own, a version where an alternate Rick and an alternate Morty successfully solved this exact same crisis and prevented the mutation from spreading, but where both of them died shortly afterward from unrelated causes. Rick and Morty then travel into this new dimension, find the corpses of their alternate selves lying in the garage, and quietly take their place in that family's life instead of continuing to live with the consequences of what they had done to their own world. The moment where Morty discovers the bodies is treated with far more weight than most other disasters shown earlier in the series. Morty stares at his own corpse and the corpse of his grandfather, both burned and lifeless on the garage floor, visibly shaken by what he is looking at. Rick's response is calm and practical. He explains that there are infinite realities out there, and that somewhere among them, a version of the two of them managed to succeed where they had failed. He tells Morty they simply needed to find one of those successful realities where the Rick and Morty living there had already died, so they could step into their lives without disrupting anyone who was still around to notice the difference. When Morty, still horrified, asks what will happen to the world they are abandoning, the one full of monstrous former humans they created, Rick tells him there is nothing to be done about it, and that dwelling on it will not change anything. The episode ends with Rick and Morty burying the bodies of their dead alternate selves in the backyard of this new home, a task presented with an unusually somber tone for the show at that point in its run, set to a quiet, melancholy song rather than a joke or a punchline. It is one of the earliest moments in the entire series where the show slows down and lets the weight of Rick's choices sit on screen without immediately laughing it off. What makes this episode so important to understanding Rick is not the disaster itself, but the specific solution he chose once the disaster had already happened. A brilliant scientist capable of building interdimensional travel technology from scratch had multiple paths available to him. He could have tried to reverse the mutation using his own knowledge of biology and chemistry, the same knowledge that let him build the love serum in the first place. He could have attempted some kind of partial fix, even an imperfect one. Instead, he chose the option that required no repair work and no confrontation with the consequences of his own actions at all. He simply found a version of reality where the problem had already been solved by someone else, then stepped into that life and left the ruined version of Earth behind entirely, never to be addressed again. This decision reveals something important about how Rick uses his intelligence. His genius is not primarily used to fix mistakes or clean up damage he has caused. It is often used to escape the consequences of that damage instead, finding a technical shortcut around the problem rather than solving the problem directly. Given access to infinite versions of reality, Rick's instinct is not to repair what broke, but to locate a version of events where the breaking never had to be dealt with by him personally. This is a very specific kind of avoidance, one that requires enormous intelligence to pull off, but which ultimately serves the exact same purpose as turning himself into a pickle to skip therapy. Both choices let Rick avoid sitting with the direct result of his own actions. The emotional cost of this decision did not stay contained to Rick alone. It shaped Morty as well, and this shows up clearly in a later episode called Ricksty Minutes, the first episode of Season 2. In that episode, Morty's sister Summer becomes deeply upset after learning through a strange pair of interdimensional cable goggles that in most alternate versions of reality, she was never born at all, since her parents chose to get an abortion in most other timelines. Overwhelmed and hurt, Summer decides to pack up and leave the house. Morty, trying to stop her, ends up revealing something he had kept hidden from her the entire time, that he is not even her original brother. He is a version of Morty from a completely different dimension, and the Rick and Morty that Summer grew up with, the ones from her own original reality, both died back during the Cronenberg disaster shown in Rick Potion number 9. To comfort Summer after telling her this, Morty repeats a piece of philosophy that sounds like something pulled straight out of Rick's own worldview. He tells her that nobody exists on purpose, nobody really belongs anywhere, and everybody is going to die eventually, before suggesting they just go watch television instead. The line works exactly the way Rick's own similar lines usually work throughout the show, offering a kind of grim comfort by pointing out that nothing really matters in the end, so there is no reason to keep dwelling on pain. Coming from Morty, a character introduced early in the show as more sensitive and more emotionally aware than his grandfather, the moment shows just how deeply this worldview had already spread from Rick into the rest of the family by only the second season. This detail matters because it shows that Rick's coping style is not something that only affects him personally. It gets passed down. Morty, having witnessed his own grandfather choose abandonment and dimensional escape over actually fixing the disaster disaster they caused together, absorbed the underlying lesson embedded in that choice. Rather than sit with pain, find a way to laugh it off or shrug it away, using logic about the size of the universe and the meaninglessness of any one event within it. Morty was only a young teenager when he learned this lesson, and by the start of Season 2, he was already repeating it to comfort someone else during a moment of real emotional pain. Rick's dismissal of larger, meaningful concepts extends beyond just disaster and death. In this same episode, Rick explains his view on love directly, describing it as nothing more than a chemical reaction that drives animals to reproduce. This blunt, clinical explanation strips away any deeper meaning from one of the most significant human emotions, reducing it down to biology and nothing else. It fits the same pattern seen throughout Rick's decision-making in this episode. Rather than treat love, connection, or responsibility as things worth taking seriously, Rick reduces them down to mechanisms that can be explained, dismissed, and moved past without much thought. There is a certain irony sitting underneath this entire episode that becomes more visible with time. Rick, the single smartest character across the entire show, faced with a problem that his own scientific mistake created, chose the solution that required the least amount of actual scientific problem solving. Finding an alternate dimension where the exact same disaster had already been solved by someone else took less real effort than developing an actual cure would have. In a strange way, Rick's genius was used here not to overcome a hard problem, but to locate a way around ever having to overcome it at all. His intelligence gave him access to a shortcut that a less capable person would never have been able to use, and he used that shortcut specifically to avoid doing the harder emotional and scientific work that repairing the damage himself would have required. This same pattern connects directly to everything already established about Rick's history. After losing Diane and Beth, rather than process that loss, he built a machine designed to keep the wound open, and spent decades hunting for revenge instead. After creating a global catastrophe with a love potion, rather than fix his own mistake, he found a version of reality where the mistake had already been solved by someone else, and simply took over that life instead. In both cases, Rick had the ability to face the problem directly. In both cases, he chose a technically brilliant workaround instead, one that avoided any real confrontation with guilt, grief, or personal responsibility. His intelligence, instead of being pointed toward healing, kept getting pointed toward escape. None of this means Rick lacks the ability to feel guilt entirely. Small moments throughout the show suggest some awareness lingers underneath the surface, even if he rarely lets it show. But awareness alone did not stop him from abandoning a ruined Earth full of transformed former humans. And it did not stop him from teaching Morty, even indirectly, that the easiest way to deal with an unbearable truth is to compare it to the size of the universe until it feels small enough to ignore. A mind capable of solving nearly any external problem still could not or would not solve the much smaller internal problem of sitting with the weight of what he had done. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This gap between raw ability and real emotional resolution did not begin or end with a love potion gone wrong. Long before Rick ever mixed that serum for Morty, he had already spent years fighting a war against an entire government. A war that shaped nearly everything about the man he eventually became, and cost him allies who paid for that fight with far more than just a ruined afternoon. Section 4. Rick's War with the Galactic Federation. Long before Rick Sanchez became known across the multiverse for portal guns and interdimensional cable, he spent decades of his life as a wanted man, fighting a war against one of the largest governments in known space. This chapter of his life cost him far more than most casual fans realize, and it shaped the version of Rick that eventually shows up on screen at the start of the series. To understand how deep his numbness runs, it helps to look at what he lost during the years he spent as a rebel fighter, long before Morty ever climbed into his spaceship for the first time. After Diane and Beth were killed by the bombing described earlier in this video, Rick spent the following years chasing down the man responsible, a version of himself the show eventually named Rick Prime. During this search, Rick became a weapons dealer, a trade that let him travel freely across different worlds while hunting for parts and information that might lead him closer to his target. This life on the run, moving from planet to planet with no fixed home and no family left to return to, put him directly in the path of a much larger conflict that was already tearing through the galaxy. At some point during this stretch of his life, when Rick was around 35 years old, he attended a large music festival held on an alien world, an event with a long and silly name that fans eventually shortened to Birding Man. It was at this festival that Rick first met a tall, serious, bird-headed alien who fans and characters alike simply call Bird Person. The two of them got high together during the festival and ended up forming a three-person band band called the Flesh Curtains, with a third friend named Squanchy playing drums. What started as a chance meeting between strangers at a party turned into one of the strongest friendships Rick has ever had in his entire life. Birdperson and Squanchy were not just musicians. Both of them were already involved in resisting a massive, powerful government known as the Galactic Federation. The Federation was run by an insect-like species called Gromflamites, and by the time it appears directly in the show, it controls thousands of Earth-like planets, extracting labor and resources from entire populations while offering very little in return. Workers on Federation-controlled worlds are paid using credits, and even something described as complimentary can leave a person deeply in debt, since the system is built to keep ordinary residents dependent on the government for basic needs. Rick, Birdperson, and Squanchy became core members of a resistance movement fighting to free different planets from Federation control, and their actions against the government were significant enough that all three of them ended up considered dangerous criminals across large parts of the galaxy. This was not a quiet background detail of Rick's life. Fighting an entire government is not something that happens casually, and it does not happen without real cost. Rick, Birdperson, and Squanchy fought in numerous battles together, risking their lives repeatedly in an effort to free planet after planet from Federation rule. Their efforts eventually led to one of the resistance movement's biggest achievements, a decisive fight known as the Battle of Blood Ridge. The rebels won this battle, dealing a serious blow to Federation control and cementing Rick, Birdperson, and Squanchy as major figures within the wider resistance. After the victory at Blood Ridge, Rick made Birdperson an offer. He asked his friend to join him permanently, traveling across the multiverse together the way Rick had already been doing on his own since losing Diane and Beth. This invitation meant a great deal coming from Rick, a man who by this point in his life had already lost almost everyone close to him, and had spent years pushing people away rather than letting them get close. Extending an offer like this to Birdperson was as close to an act of trust as Rick was capable of at the time. Birdperson turned him down. He chose to stay behind rather than join Rick's ongoing life of multiverse travel and revenge. The show does not spend much time explaining the exact reasoning behind this decision, but the effect on Rick is made clear enough through his reaction. Rick was hurt by the rejection, and rather than deal with that disappointment directly, he did what he always does. He left, continuing his search for Rick Prime completely on his own once again, adding one more name to the growing list of people he had lost or been separated from over the years. During the following stretch of his search, something else changed in Rick that the show confirms directly. As his hunt for Rick Prime kept turning up nothing, Rick's mental state grew worse. He began drinking heavily during this period, using alcohol as a way to cope with the mounting frustration and grief of a search that never seemed to end. This detail matters because it shows that Rick's well-known drinking habit did not start as a personality quirk or a joke built into his character design. It grew directly out of a specific, sustained period of failure and loneliness, one where a man capable of building interdimensional travel technology still could not find the one person responsible for destroying his family, no matter how many years he spent looking. Years passed, and Birdperson eventually re-entered Rick's life in a more personal way. At some point, Birdperson began a relationship with a young woman named Tammy, someone Rick's granddaughter, Summer, knew from school. The relationship grew serious enough that Birdperson and Tammy decided to get married, and the wedding, held on a planet called Squanch, became a major event that brought together nearly everyone connected to Rick's long history of rebellion against the Federation. Rick attended, along with the rest of the Smith family, and the event was treated as a rare, joyful gathering for a man who had spent so much of his life running, fighting, and losing people. The wedding did not stay joyful for long. During the reception, Tammy revealed the truth about herself in front of everyone. She was not simply a young woman who had fallen in love with Birdperson. She was an undercover agent working for the Galactic Federation, and the entire relationship, along with the wedding itself, had been built specifically to lure Rick, Birdperson, Squanchy, and the rest of their allies into one location so the Federation could capture or eliminate them all at once. Once she revealed this, she announced that everyone present was under arrest, and Federation agents began attacking the wedding guests. In the middle of this chaos, Tammy shot and killed Birdperson, ending the life of one of the very few people Rick had ever considered a true friend. Rick and Squanchy fought back against the surrounding agents, managing to fend off enough of them to escape with the rest of the Smith family. But Birdperson himself was gone, killed by the same woman he had chosen to marry, in front of the friend who had known him since a chance meeting at a music festival years earlier. The fallout from this single event reshaped the rest of Rick's family's life almost immediately. With the Federation now actively hunting them, Rick and the Smith family could no longer safely safely return to Earth. They spent time drifting between strange, remote planets, searching for somewhere far enough from Federation reach to hide. At one especially low point, while the family debated their situation without realizing Rick could hear them from beneath the floor of the small house they were hiding in, Jerry suggested that the family should return to Earth and turn Rick in to the authorities, arguing that Rick's selfish choices were the reason they were all in danger in the first place. The rest of the family disagreed. Beth, Summer, and Morty defended Rick, telling Jerry they wanted to stay with him no matter the risk because of the unconditional love they felt for him as a member of their family. Rick, listening to this entire conversation from hiding, heard his family choose him even after everything his past had cost them, even after watching one of his oldest friends get killed right in front of him at what was supposed to be a celebration. This moment carries weight that goes far beyond a single dramatic scene. For most of his adult life, Rick had operated as someone who expected to lose everyone eventually, someone who built machines to keep old wounds open rather than trust new relationships to hold. Here, hiding under the floor of a stranger's house on a planet far from Earth, he got to hear, without anyone performing it for his benefit, that the family he had spent so little time actually parenting still chose to stand by him. It did not undo what happened to Bird Person. It did not erase decades of running from grief through violence, alcohol, and isolation. But it showed that somewhere underneath all of that numbness, people still saw enough in Rick worth defending. The consequences of this chapter in Rick's life stretched on for years afterward. The Galactic Federation eventually caught up with Rick directly, leading to his arrest and imprisonment, a turning point that forced him into an entirely different kind of confrontation with his past and his choices. Long before that arrest, however, the years spent fighting the Federation alongside Bird Person and Squanchy had already shaped Rick in lasting ways. He had proven himself capable of real loyalty, real risk, and real friendship. Even while carrying grief he refused to process directly. He had also proven, through the loss of Bird Person and the years of drinking that came before it, that every relationship he allowed himself to build still carried the risk of ending in the same kind of sudden, violent loss that had already taken Diane and Beth away from him. Rick's war with the Galactic Federation is often treated by fans as background material, a piece of lore mentioned in passing during louder, more visually striking episodes. But looked at directly, it tells a clear story about how numbness spreads and deepens over time. A man who lost his family to a bomb went on to build new bonds through music, rebellion, and shared risk, only to watch one of those bonds end in gunfire, at a wedding meant to celebrate love rather than destroy it. Each loss added another layer onto the pattern already set in motion years earlier, reinforcing the same lesson Rick seemed to keep learning again and again, that connection eventually leads to pain, and pain is easier to survive if you never fully let yourself feel it in the first place. What makes this stretch of Rick's story even more important is how it foreshadows the choice he would eventually make when the Federation finally caught up with him and his family for good. The instinct to protect the people he loves, the same instinct that made him hide the truth of his identity for years and quietly listen from beneath a floor rather than confront his family directly, would resurface again later in a much bigger, much more costly moment. One where Rick would have to decide exactly how much of himself he was willing to give up to keep the people around him safe. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Before that moment arrives, though, another side of Rick's coping habits comes into focus, one that has nothing to do with government agents, weddings, or wars. It shows up in the quiet, ordinary spaces of everyday life. When Rick and Morty attempt something far stranger than fighting a galactic government, they try to remove the darkest parts of themselves entirely, just to get a break from carrying it all at once. Section 5. When Rick chose to split himself in two. Most people who feel emotionally overwhelmed try to talk to someone, take a break, or slowly work through what is bothering them. Rick Sanchez tried something else entirely. In an episode that treats mental exhaustion as a problem that can be solved with machinery, Rick attempted to remove the darker parts of his own mind completely, as if guilt, cruelty, and pain were simply substances that could be drained out of a body like poison. The results revealed something about Rick that even he did not seem to expect, and it says more about his relationship with his own feelings than almost any other single episode in the series. This story unfolds in an episode called Rest and Ricklaxation, the 6th episode of Season 3, which first aired on August 27, 2017. It was directed by Anthony Chun and Wesley Archer, and written by Tom Kaufman. The episode opens right after Rick and Morty return from an especially long and dangerous adventure, one that stretched on for 6 exhausting days and nearly got them both killed multiple times. By the time they make it home, both of them are so worn down that they start showing signs of real mental strain. Rick, watching Morty struggle and clearly feeling the weight of it himself, himself, decides they have earned a vacation. The two of them travel to an alien spa built specifically for relaxation, a strange facility where guests are swallowed by a giant blob-like creature that somehow soothes anything it consumes. After a full round of these bizarre treatments, Rick and Morty are offered one final option, a machine that claims it can completely remove all of a person's toxins, mental as well as physical. Curious and worn out enough to try almost anything, they agree to use it. The machine appears to malfunction shortly after they step inside, and Rick and Morty wake up in a disgusting, toxic wasteland filled with monstrous creatures. At first, they assume the explosion destroyed the entire spa around them. The real explanation turns out to be much stranger. They are not the actual Rick and Morty. They are the toxic material that the machine successfully removed from the real Rick and Morty, who are already on their way home, clean, refreshed, and completely unaware that a separate physical version of their own worst traits is still alive and stranded in a wasteland built to contain exactly that kind of waste. This detail alone says something important. The machine did not simply calm Rick and Morty down or help them relax. It physically separated the parts of them considered toxic from the rest of their personality, treating traits like cruelty, dishonesty, addiction, insecurity, and self-loathing as if they were medical waste that could be extracted and discarded like a tumor. And it worked well enough that two fully separate, fully conscious beings were created out of the material removed from just one adventure gone wrong. The show describes Toxic Rick directly as the rude, lying, alcoholic, and self-important side of Rick's personality. Essentially, the same genius intelligence wrapped around every ugly trait Rick usually keeps folded into his regular behavior. Toxic Morty, by contrast, embodies the nervous, desperate, and self-loathing parts of Morty's personality, the anxious insecurity that usually simmers underneath his more hopeful, likable moments on screen. Meanwhile, back at home, the real, newly purified Rick and Morty return looking and acting noticeably different. Rick's skin, normally a grayish tone tied directly to his heavy drinking, returns to a healthier color once the alcoholic and toxic parts of him have been physically removed. This single visual detail confirms something the show rarely states so plainly. Rick's physical appearance throughout the series is already shaped by years of alcohol use, and stripping that toxicity away changes him on a level visible from the outside, not just emotionally. While the cleaned-up versions of Rick and Morty settle back into ordinary life, the toxic versions begin plotting their own survival inside the wasteland they were dumped into. Meanwhile, clean Morty starts experiencing life without any of his usual insecurity holding him back. Freed from self-doubt, he becomes noticeably more confident at school, boosting the confidence of classmates around him and even catching the attention of Mr. Goldenfold, a teacher who rarely has anything positive to say about Morty under normal circumstances. Encouraged by this sudden change, Morty finally works up the nerve to ask out Jessica, the classmate he has had feelings for throughout much of the series. The date goes badly almost immediately, since Morty's confidence, without any of his usual nervous self-awareness balancing it out, comes across as overwhelming and off-putting rather than charming. After the failed date, Morty quickly moves on and starts talking to another girl named Stacy instead, showing just how detached this new, unburdened version of himself has become from the emotional caution that usually defines him. Back in the toxic wasteland, Toxic Rick manages to make contact with Clean Rick through a transmission device, revealing that the toxic versions of himself and Morty are sentient, self-aware, and just as intelligent as their cleaner counterparts. Clean Rick begins arranging a plan to merge himself and Morty back together with their toxic selves, apparently believing that reuniting the two halves is the only way to restore some kind of natural balance. When Morty finds out about this plan, still riding high on his newfound confidence, he initially resists the idea entirely, wanting to hold on to the version of himself that feels lighter and freer than he has ever felt before. The situation grows more dangerous once Morty, with help from Stacy, discovers that Toxic Rick has no intention of simply merging back into a whole. Toxic Rick's actual plan is to take the place of the real Rick and Morty entirely, discarding them rather than reuniting with them. Once this deception is uncovered, Rick confronts Toxic Rick directly, and the two versions of himself turn out to be evenly matched in a fight, each one just as capable, resourceful, and dangerous as the other. Realizing a direct fight will not settle anything, Toxic Rick decides to take a different approach entirely. Rather than continue struggling to escape his toxic form, he decides it would be far easier to make the rest of the world just as toxic as he already is. Using a piece of technology called a Moonlight Tower, along with several small devices called Miniverse batteries, Toxic Rick begins turning the entire planet toxic, spreading his own corrupted traits outward onto everyone around him rather than working to fix anything within himself. This is the moment where the the episode reveals its most important detail. Facing a version of himself who has decided that spreading corruption is easier than confronting it, Clean Rick figures out a way to stop him, but the method he chooses says something remarkable about how Rick actually sees himself. Rather than relying purely on strength or technology, Clean Rick shoots Toxic Morty with a dose of poison, gambling on the idea that Toxic Rick still cares enough about Morty to give up his entire plan in order to save him. Clean Rick had correctly deduced that the real Rick's own compassion for Morty, something Rick privately considers a weakness in himself, still exists inside the toxic version of Rick as well, since that trait was never something the machine successfully removed in the first place. In other words, the very trait Rick had hoped to filter out along with his rudeness, dishonesty, and drinking turned out to be too deeply woven into who he actually is to be extracted as toxic waste at all. Toxic Rick, faced with watching Toxic Morty die from the poison, becomes furious, but he still chooses to merge back together with Clean Rick in order to save him. This single decision undoes the entire toxic plan and instantly reverses the corruption spreading across the planet, restoring Earth to normal, even as the ordinary people affected are left with strange, fleeting memories of briefly feeling like better versions of themselves during the chaos. Reuniting Toxic Rick with Clean Rick fixes half the problem, but Clean Morty still refuses to merge back with his own toxic counterpart, choosing instead to keep living as the confident, guilt-free version of himself that emerged from the machine. Weeks pass, and Clean Morty relocates to New York City, building a successful career as a ruthless stockbroker who feels no weight from guilt or self-doubt while making decisions that would clearly bother the ordinary, more anxious version of himself. Eventually, Rick tracks him down and forces the reunion, using a makeshift device to reintroduce the toxic, self-loathing parts of Morty's personality back into him. Once the merge is complete, Morty returns to school and reconnects with Jessica, who notices something meaningful in the change. She tells him he finally feels like himself again, a comment that only makes sense if the confident, unburdened version of Morty that existed for those few weeks was, in some important way, missing something essential. What this episode reveals about Rick runs deeper than a single strange science experiment gone sideways. Rick voluntarily chose to undergo a process specifically designed to strip away every trait he considers negative about himself, including his drinking, his cruelty, his dishonesty, and by extension, whatever softer feelings might be tangled up alongside those traits. He was not forced into this. He suggested the vacation, agreed to the treatment, and stepped into the machine expecting it to leave him lighter, cleaner, and easier to live with. This choice mirrors almost everything already established about how Rick handles pain throughout the rest of the series. Rather than sit with difficult feelings and work through them slowly, his instinct is to look for a mechanism, a shortcut, or, in this case, a literal machine that can simply remove the problem instead. The most telling detail in the entire episode is the fact that Rick's compassion for Morty survived the extraction process at all. If the machine was designed to filter out every toxic trait Rick carries, and Rick himself privately views his emotional attachment to Morty as a weakness rather than a strength, then logically, that attachment should have ended up sorted into the toxic pile along with the rudeness and the drinking. Instead, it stayed present in both versions of Rick, clean and toxic alike, proving that this particular trait is not actually a flaw layered on top of who Rick really is. It is part of his core identity, inseparable from him no matter how thoroughly the rest of his personality gets filtered, scrubbed, or split apart. This detail complicates the picture of Rick as someone who feels nothing. Throughout the series, Rick presents himself as detached, self-sufficient, and unbothered by connection, treating relationships as disposable and vulnerability as something to avoid at almost any cost. Yet even a machine built specifically to extract every negative trait from his mind and body could not remove the part of him that cares about his grandson enough to risk everything trying to save him. Rick did not choose to keep that trait. It simply refused to leave, embedded somewhere too deep for even advanced alien technology to touch. There is also something worth noticing in Clean Morty's arc running alongside all of this. Freed from insecurity and self-doubt, Morty did not become a better, happier version of himself. He became someone capable of thriving in a career built on ruthlessness, someone who felt no guilt over decisions that would normally weigh on him. The show frames this version of Morty as missing something important, rather than improved, reinforcing the idea that the uncomfortable, difficult parts of a person's inner life are not simply obstacles standing between them and a better version of themselves. They are often part of what keeps a person recognizably, meaningfully human in the first place. Taken together, this episode suggests that Rick's numbness is not something imposed on him entirely from the outside by grief and loss alone. It is something he actively tries to manufacture and maintain, even when given the chance to remove it through outside means. Given a literal machine capable of stripping away his own perceived toxic specific traits, Rick still ended up with his care for Morty intact, whether he wanted it there or not. The very thing keeping him tethered to at least one meaningful relationship turned out to be the one part of himself he could not successfully discard, no matter how hard the rest of his life seems built around trying to feel as little as possible. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This same tension between Rick's desire for detachment and the parts of himself he cannot fully escape becomes even harder to ignore once his identity gets stretched across an entire society built out of nothing but versions of himself, a place where being one of countless identical Ricks raises an entirely different question about what, if anything, actually makes any single version of him matter at all. Section 6. The Citadel of Ricks and Becoming Just One of Infinite Copies. Rick Sanchez has spent much of his life running from a version of himself that murdered his family. But somewhere along the way, he also became part of a much larger, stranger problem. One built entirely around the existence of countless other versions of himself. Across the wider multiverse, an entire society exists made up of nothing but different Ricks and different Mortys, all pulled from separate realities and gathered together in one place. This society, known as the Citadel of Ricks, forces a question that goes beyond grief or revenge. If there are infinite versions of you scattered across infinite realities, what does it actually mean to be one specific version of yourself at all? The Citadel first appears in an episode called Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, where Rick C-137 is brought in under suspicion of murdering 27 other Ricks. He meets with a ruling body known as the Council of Ricks before eventually escaping. During the investigation into this case, it is revealed that the Rick originally accused of criminal behavior was not actually behaving on his own. He turned out to be a robot, secretly controlled by someone else through a hidden receiver implanted in his body. Among the Mortys swept up and relocated to the Citadel as part of this same storyline is a quiet character wearing an eye patch, who removes it in the closing moments of the episode, revealing a transparent mechanical eye underneath. This character later becomes known throughout the series as Evil Morty, and his presence inside the Citadel from this very first appearance turns out to matter far more than anyone watching at the time could have guessed. The Citadel itself functions as a trans-dimensional city, existing in its own pocket of space separate from any single reality, reachable only through specific coordinates within a structure the show calls the Central Finite Curve. It was originally built as a secret refuge, a place where Ricks and Mortys from across the multiverse could protect each other from shared enemies, including threats like the Galactic Federation. The idea, at least on paper, sounds almost noble. Countless versions of the same brilliant, dangerous man banding together for mutual protection, rather than spending their lives isolated and hunted one dimension at a time. The Citadel was governed for a long stretch of its history by a group known as the Council of Ricks, made up of 6 standout versions of Rick who had distinguished themselves enough to earn a seat at the top of this new society. The spokesman for this council was a version known as Rick the Fourth. Alongside him sat Quantum Rick, Maximus Rickamus, Zeta Alpha Rick, Rictiminus Sanchezaminius, and one more member whose presence on the council carries enormous weight once later revelations connect back to it. That 6th member was Rick Prime, the exact version of Rick responsible for killing Diane and Beth all those years earlier. This detail changes the entire meaning of the Citadel's existence. The very man Rick C-137 spent decades hunting across the multiverse was, for at least part of that time, sitting on the ruling council of an organization built specifically to protect Ricks from danger and hold them accountable to one another. The system meant to offer safety and order to countless versions of the same man was, at some point, partly overseen by the one version responsible for the single most devastating act of violence in Rick C-137's entire life. Rick spent years searching blindly across infinite realities for his family's killer, without ever realizing that a structure claiming to represent order and protection for all Ricks had, at least briefly, given that very killer a formal position of power. Rick C-137 was offered a seat on this same council at one point, and he refused it outright. He viewed the entire concept as hypocritical, arguing that a group of Ricks forming their own government specifically to hide from other governments defeated the purpose of being the kind of person who resists authority and control in the first place. His refusal marked him as a rogue in the eyes of the Citadel's leadership, one of a small number of independent Ricks who rejected the idea of joining any larger structure, even one built by and for people who looked and thought exactly like him. Despite refusing any formal role, Rick still played a major part in shaping the Citadel's fate. Years later, Later, in an episode called The Rickshank Rickdemption, the Council of Ricks ordered Rick C-137's assassination after he was captured by the Galactic Federation, viewing his capture as a liability that put every other version of Rick at risk. In response, Rick teleported the entire Citadel directly into a Galactic Federation prison, an act that caused the deaths of countless Ricks and Mortys living inside it. During the resulting chaos, Rick infiltrated the Council's inner chambers, either disguised as Quantum Rick or using his body as a host, and personally killed 3 of the remaining council members by gunfire while electrocuting the 4th. A structure built to protect thousands of versions of the same man was nearly destroyed from the inside by one furious, betrayed version of that exact man. The Citadel did not stay destroyed for long. In a later episode called The Ricklantis Mix-Up, surviving Ricks and Mortys worked to rebuild the entire society, largely through donations, even reaching out to Rick C-137 despite his role in nearly wiping it out entirely. Rather than restoring the previous open system of governance, a secretive group known as the Shadow Council quietly took control behind the scenes, running the rebuilt Citadel while presenting a much calmer, more orderly appearance to its population. Underneath this surface, deep inequality separated wealthy, powerful Ricks from ordinary Mortys, many of whom were pushed into dangerous jobs like police work or treated as disposable labor within the rebuilt system. This inequality reveals something disturbing about how the Citadel actually valued the individuals living inside it. Mortys, in particular, were treated as replaceable parts rather than people. At one point earlier in the Citadel's history, the Council rewarded Rick C-137 with a ticket, making him eligible for what the show calls a free replacement Morty, meant to be used if his current grandson was ever injured or killed. The existence of this system alone says everything necessary about how deeply the Citadel had normalized treating a single Morty's life as something interchangeable with any other Morty pulled from a nearly identical reality. Losing a grandchild, something that should carry enormous personal weight, had been reduced inside this society to a matter of paperwork and inventory. Eventually, leadership of the Citadel shifted again, this time towards something far more dangerous. An election was held, and the winner turned out to be a seemingly ordinary Morty who was, in fact, the same eye-patch-wearing Morty first introduced back in Close Rick Counters of the Rick kind. Elected without anyone realizing his true identity, this Morty became President Morty, and his first act in power was to consolidate control by executing every dissenting Rick from the previous Shadow Council, ejecting their bodies into open space. Under his rule, the Citadel appeared calmer and more functional on the surface, with more Mortys given jobs and even portal guns of their own, seemingly signaling greater equality between the two groups. This appearance of progress was a disguise. Beneath the streets of the rebuilt Citadel, President Morty operated a hidden factory, staffed by deformed, cloned Mortys, secretly working to build a device capable of breaking through the boundary the show calls the Central Finite Curve, the invisible structure containing every reality Rick and Morty are capable of reaching through ordinary portal travel. President Morty eventually gained access to the specific information needed to break through this boundary by downloading the entire contents of Rick C-137's mind, extracting knowledge that had never been intentionally shared with him. Through this process, President Morty uncovered something the show had never directly revealed before. The Citadel had been secretly manipulating events across many realities to bring specific versions of Beth and Jerry together, engineering circumstances so that they would eventually have a son named Morty. Once born, these Mortys were being cloned in bulk and sold to Ricks as subservient sidekicks, meaning the very relationship between countless Ricks and their grandsons throughout the multiverse had been artificially manufactured and commercialized by the Citadel itself, rather than occurring naturally, the way most families assumed. Once President Morty finished extracting everything he needed, he set his final plan into motion. He hacked every portal gun connected to the Citadel, tainting their fluid supplies so that any Rick or Morty attempting to escape through their own gun would only be sent into dangerous, uninhabitable dimensions instead of somewhere safe. He then launched what the show refers to as Operation Phoenix, a program that killed enormous numbers of Ricks and Mortys throughout the Citadel all at once. Using a private shuttle he had built in secret, President Morty escaped through the Central Finite Curve entirely, an act that triggered the destruction of the entire Citadel behind him. Rick C-137 and his own Morty managed to survive by detaching a section of the city known as Mortyburg from the rest of the structure, just before everything else was destroyed. In the aftermath, whatever remained of the Citadel became little more than a refugee shelter, housing cloned Ricks and Mortys who had been created inside the facility and had nowhere else to go once the system that manufactured and controlled their entire existence collapsed. An entire society built around infinite versions of the same two people ended not with peace or resolution, but with mass death, betrayal, and a population of clones left stranded with no home dimension to return to at all. Looking at the full history of the Citadel, side by side with everything already known about Rick's personal numbness, paints a much larger picture than any single episode alone could offer. Rick spent years hunting one specific version of himself across the multiverse for murdering his family, all while an entire government made up of countless other versions of himself existed nearby. One that at various points literally included his family's killer among its ruling members, treated grandchildren as replaceable inventory, manufactured entire family relationships for profit, and eventually destroyed itself through betrayal and mass execution from within. Rick's refusal to join this system, his choice to remain a rogue rather than take a seat among his fellow Ricks, stands as one of the few consistent choices in his life that actually lines up with something resembling personal values rather than pure avoidance. At the same time, existing within a multiverse where an entire society can be built entirely out of duplicate versions of yourself raises an uncomfortable question about identity that Rick never seems fully able to escape. If thousands of other Ricks exist, capable of the same intelligence, the same choices, and, in at least one confirmed case, the exact same violent act that destroyed his family, then what does it actually mean to be this particular version of Rick, walking through this particular set of consequences? Being labeled the Rickest Rick, a title other characters occasionally use to describe Rick C-137, only carries meaning inside a system that already treats every other version of Rick as a measurable, comparable, and ultimately replaceable data point. Standing out as the most authentic version of yourself only matters in a world that has already reduced identity itself down to something closer to a product line. This tension between individual grief and multiversal replaceability adds another layer onto everything already explored about Rick's numbness. He is not simply a man running from personal trauma. He is a man running through a multiverse that has systematically stripped meaning away from identity itself, turning fatherhood, grandchildren, and even his own uniqueness into something that can be manufactured, cloned, sold, or executed en masse without much lasting consequence to the wider system. Surviving inside that kind of world, with any sense of personal meaning intact, requires either total detachment or an extraordinary act of defiance. And Rick's entire relationship with the Citadel suggests he has spent years trying, imperfectly, to choose the second option, while still carrying all the damage of the first. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. None of this fully answers where Rick's family's actual killer ended up once the smoke cleared on all of this Citadel history, or what it eventually cost Rick to finally catch up to him after decades of searching. That confrontation, delayed across years of the show's timeline, and finally resolved only in its most recent seasons, reveals the last and heaviest piece of everything Rick has been running from since the very beginning. Section 7. Rick Prime, the man who made him this way. For decades, across countless dimensions, Rick Sanchez searched for one specific man. Not a monster, not a god, not some grand cosmic threat, but another version of himself. A man who happened to share his face, his voice, and his intelligence, yet who had done something Rick could never forgive. This search finally came to an end in Season 7, in an episode called Unmortricken, and the way it ended tells viewers something far more important than the fight itself ever could. Unmortricken is the 5th episode of Season 7, the 66th episode of the series overall, and it premiered on November 12, 2023. It was written by Albro Lundy and James Siciliano and directed by Jacob Hare. The episode carries a mature content rating, and its title is a direct reference to the film Unforgiven, a nod that fits the story's focus on an aging man finally settling an old, violent score he has carried for most of his adult life. The episode opens not with Rick, but with evil Morty, revealing in detail exactly how he came to exist outside the boundaries of the central finite curve, the structure containing every reality Rick and Morty are normally able to reach through ordinary portal travel. Living peacefully in this space beyond the curve, evil Morty encounters other multiversal travelers entirely unrelated to any version of Rick, since Rick is not the smartest being that exists in these outer regions, only the smartest being within the specific bounds of the curve itself. The episode also reveals a small visual detail about portal technology in general, showing that portals generated by portal guns can appear in a variety of colors depending on their origin, though green remains the color most commonly favored among different versions of Rick living inside the curve. At one point, evil Morty crosses paths with a family living beyond the curve, who closely resemble resemble a well-known cartoon family built around futuristic space-age life. A small stylistic touch marking just how different life looks once a person escapes the curve entirely. This same opening sequence finally reveals in full detail the exact moment that turned an ordinary Morty into the calculating figure known throughout the rest of the series as Evil Morty. Following an argument with his own Rick, the Morty who would become Evil Morty offers his grandfather a six-pack of beer as a way to smooth things over between them. Later that same night, once his Rick has become thoroughly drunk, this same Morty returns wearing an eye patch, implanting a control device directly into his Rick's brain while he is too impaired to resist or even notice what is happening. This single quiet scene finally confirms, in canon, the specific origin of Evil Morty's transformation, showing that his entire journey toward becoming a ruthless, calculating figure began with a moment of betrayal carried out against someone left completely vulnerable through drink, a detail that adds an uncomfortable parallel to Rick's own long-standing relationship with alcohol covered earlier in this video. Once Rick, Morty, and Evil Morty are captured together and thrown into Rick Prime's prison, the identities of the other trapped Ricks reveal something important about the scale of Rick Prime's violence. Among the captured Ricks are versions clearly styled after well-known action heroes, including one modeled after a famous fedora-wearing archaeologist adventurer, another styled after a suave, tuxedoed secret agent, and a third resembling a rugged action hero known for surviving impossible situations inside tall buildings. Every one of these captured Ricks lost his own version of Diane to Rick Prime, confirming that the tragedy Rick has carried for decades was never unique to his own dimension alone. Rick Prime had been killing Dianes across a huge number of realities, methodically targeting an enormous number of different versions of the same woman, leaving behind an entire hidden population of grieving husbands scattered throughout the multiverse, each one carrying some version of the exact same wound Rick has carried since the very beginning of this story. The brutal nature of Rick Prime's imprisoned Ricks becomes clear during what the show refers to as the semi-final round of the Battle Royale. While Rick, Morty, and Evil Morty wait and argue over their next move, a nearby glass arena reveals a savage confrontation between the archaeologist-styled Rick and a disheveled, rugged-looking Rick wearing a long coat. The archaeologist Rick appears to be winning at first, using a whip to violently beat his opponent, splattering enough blood across the connecting glass wall to briefly block the group's view of the fight entirely. Once the blood clears, however, it becomes clear the long coat-wearing Rick has actually survived completely unharmed, using his defeated opponent's own body to wipe the blood from the glass before electrocuting him to death, then turning to glare through the glass, clearly impatient for his own turn in the next round. This single grotesque exchange between two side characters, neither of whom factors meaningfully into the rest of the plot, reinforces just how far Rick Prime's cruelty extends beyond Rick's own personal tragedy, treating an entire arena full of grieving men as disposable entertainment rather than people. A small but important detail from this same sequence involves Evil Morty's own defenses. At one point, Evil Morty deploys a personal force field capable of blocking both Rick's weapon and a shot fired by the archaeologist-styled Rick without any difficulty. This same force field fails completely, however, the moment Rick Prime fires his own shotgun, offering a brief but telling glimpse into exactly how far Rick Prime's personal arsenal exceeds even the combined defenses of two of the multiverse's most dangerous minds working together. Rick fights his way through a series of automated defenses guarding Rick Prime's hidden base, eventually reaching the main chamber where the Omega device itself is kept. Rick Prime greets him with open amusement rather than fear, mockingly referring to him by a nickname built around his greatest loss, and expressing surprise that this particular grieving version of himself managed to track him down after everything. He is angered rather than impressed to see that Morty and Evil Morty followed Rick into the chamber, despite his wishes to face this moment alone. Rick Prime then reveals he already knows about a detail Rick has kept hidden for years: the fact that Rick built an artificial version of Diane's voice into the personality of his own spaceship, essentially keeping a version of his dead wife constantly present in his daily life through technology alone. Rick Prime mocks him for this choice, framing it as pathetic rather than sympathetic. He then threatens to use the Omega device again, this time targeting Rick and the family currently standing in front of him. To prove exactly how serious this threat is, he immediately kills a character known as Slow Mobius, someone the show has previously suggested may be a relative of Rick's, possibly an uncle, using the device right in front of everyone. Slow Mobius disappears entirely, erased instantly, leaving Rick horrified and Morty confused about who exactly they just watched vanish. This single single act triggers a brutal fight between Rick Prime, Morty, and Evil Morty, one described by people who have reviewed the episode as barely winnable, even with all three of them working together. Rick alone is not enough to defeat the man responsible for his entire life's worth of pain. It takes Evil Morty stepping in, incapacitating Rick Prime through his own resources, and stealing the schematics and functioning parts of the Omega device itself before Rick is finally given the chance to face his enemy one final time, without any weapon left standing between them.
During this final exchange, Rick Prime attempts to reason with Rick one last time, pointing out that Evil Morty now poses a far greater threat than Rick Prime himself ever did, and reminding Rick that his own choice to explore the multiverse in the first place only happened because of what Rick Prime did to him all those years ago. What happens next is presented without any triumphant music or sense of victory. Rick beats Rick Prime to death using his own hands, a slow, brutal, deeply personal act rather than a quick or clean kill. Throughout this final beating, Rick Prime never stops mocking him, laughing and taunting Rick for finally becoming exactly the kind of ruthless, violent man Rick Prime himself always was. Even while dying, Rick Prime frames Rick's entire revenge-driven life as proof that Rick had already turned into a version of the very monster he had spent decades hunting. Rick delivers the final blow anyway, ending the life of the man who caused the bombing that started this entire story decades earlier in a garage that no longer exists in any recognizable form. Once Rick Prime is dead, Evil Morty makes his true position clear. Rather than handing over the deactivated Omega device, he keeps it, warning Rick as he leaves that this weapon now belongs to him instead. Morty, watching all of this unfold, comforts Rick as the two of them return home, though very little about the moment feels like closure. According to people who reviewed this episode closely, Rick ends up completely unsatisfied and without a clear sense of purpose, since the entire decades-long pursuit of revenge only really succeeded in transferring one of the most dangerous weapons in the multiverse directly into the hands of someone else entirely, someone with no guaranteed loyalty to Rick or his family at all. A short scene following the credits offers a quiet contrast to everything that just happened. Slow Mobius's wife, left behind after his sudden erasure, begins her own personal search across the multiverse, searching for a version of her husband the same way Rick spent years searching for Rick Prime. Unlike Rick, she eventually meets another person who lost his own spouse under similarly painful circumstances, and the two of them build a new life together instead of continuing the search indefinitely. Her story ends in quiet acceptance and new connection. Rick's story, by contrast, ends in an empty, hollow silence, having spent nearly his entire adult life chasing a resolution that, once finally achieved, left him with nothing solid to hold on to in its place. This contrast matters because it shows two very different responses to nearly identical circumstances, both grounded firmly in the show's own canon. One person, faced with sudden, unexplainable loss, eventually chose to build something new rather than dedicate the rest of her life to searching for what was taken from her. The other person, given every scientific advantage imaginable, chose instead to pour decades of effort into revenge, only to discover that killing the man responsible did not restore anything he had lost and did not undo any of the pain that loss had caused along the way. Unmortrican received an overwhelmingly positive response once it aired, eventually earning recognition as one of the strongest episodes in the show's entire history. The entertainment outlet IGN placed it at number 9 on its ranking of the series' best episodes, and multiple reviewers pointed out that the storyline finally resolved here had technically begun nearly a decade earlier, tracing all the way back to the character's first hints introduced through earlier Evil Morty and Citadel-focused episodes released years before this one. Critics specifically praised the episode's animation and background art, along with the complicated, morally uncomfortable way the show chose to handle Rick Prime's actual death, refusing to present it as a clean, satisfying resolution even after so many years of build-up. Several analyses of the episode also pointed out that Evil Morty explicitly warns Rick against continuing to repeat the same destructive cycle of obsession and revenge that has already cost him so much, a warning Rick receives but never fully absorbs, given how empty and purposeless he feels immediately after finally getting the revenge he spent decades pursuing. The show continues exploring the emotional aftermath of Rick Prime's death through the remainder of Season 7, culminating in the season finale, an episode called Fear No Mort. In that episode, Rick and Morty encounter a strange location known simply as The Hole, a space capable of simulating a person's greatest fear the moment they step inside it. According to reviews of the episode, Morty Morty is forced to confront the possibility that Rick might not need him anymore if Rick ever became genuinely happy, a fear that terrifies him, even though he ultimately manages to face it directly. Rick's own arc throughout the finale circles back to the same emptiness introduced immediately after Rick Prime's death, forcing him to seriously question what his life is actually for, now that the singular obsession driving nearly every choice he has made for decades has finally been resolved. This detail lines up with something the show's own writers have discussed directly. According to comments from the show's creative team, letting evil Morty walk away with the Omega device effectively means Rick handed the most dangerous weapon in the multiverse over to someone who is not himself, revealing that, on some level, Rick may be more invested in his own eventual destruction than in protecting himself from the very danger he spent his whole life fighting against. Killing Rick Prime did not give Rick back anything meaningful. It simply removed the one clear, defined enemy that had structured his entire existence since the day Diane and Beth died, leaving him facing an emptiness that revenge, no matter how thoroughly executed, was never actually capable of filling in the first place. This is, in many ways, the clearest and most direct piece of evidence the show offers about the true nature of Rick's numbness. For years, viewers might have assumed that catching Rick Prime, ending his life, and finally closing this decades-long chapter would restore something in Rick, even a small piece of the man he might have been before losing his family. Instead, the show presents his victory as hollow, unsatisfying, and disorienting, proof that the wound Rick carried was never something revenge could actually heal. He built his entire identity around a single, all-consuming goal, and once that goal was finally achieved, there was nothing left underneath it to catch him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Long before this final confrontation ever took place, however, Rick had already found another way to numb himself against everything he refused to feel directly. It did not require decades of interdimensional hunting, elaborate traps, or a final violent reckoning. It only required a bottle, and it followed him through nearly every stage of the story already covered so far. Section 8. The nights Rick chose alcohol over feeling. Rick Sanchez rarely appears on screen without a metal flask close at hand, and by now, that flask has become just as recognizable a part of his character as his portal gun or his lab coat. For years, this constant drinking mostly played out as a running joke, a quirky habit meant to make an already strange character feel even more distinct. But the show eventually gave this habit real weight, tracing it back to specific, painful moments in Rick's life, rather than leaving it as a harmless punchline forever. The flask itself carries more meaning than it might first appear to. According to comments from the show's co-creator Dan Harmon, Rick's consistent preference for plain vodka, a drink with almost no flavor of its own, reflects something deliberate about his character. Vodka is an ordinary, unremarkable drink that originated on Earth, and Harmon has explained that Rick's attachment to it ties into his own sense of identity. Despite having access to any substance in the entire multiverse, Rick chooses something painfully ordinary, something that keeps him tethered to being human in at least one small physical way, even while every other part of his life pulls him further away from anything resembling a normal existence. Rather than invent some advanced piece of technology to numb himself more efficiently, Rick reaches for the same drink available in any liquor store on Earth, a small, strange thread of humanity buried underneath everything else about him. Interestingly, the show itself never fully confirms what Rick's flask actually contains, or whether it even originates from Earth at all, leaving even this small, grounding detail wrapped in a bit of ambiguity, fitting for a character who rarely lets anyone see the full picture of what he is carrying. Early episodes of the show treated Rick's drinking mostly as dark comedy, a habit exaggerated for laughs rather than explored seriously. This started to change by the time an episode called Ricksy Business aired, the 11th and final episode of Season 1, which gave audiences more insight into both his drinking and his broader relationship with substances beyond simple comic exaggeration. This episode aired on April 14, 2014, written by Ryan Ridley and Tom Kaufman, and directed by Steven Sandoval. Its title plays on the name of an older film about a teenager whose parents leave him alone in the house, and the plot follows a nearly identical setup. With Beth and Jerry away, taking part in an elaborate reenactment cruise built around a famous shipwreck film, Rick is left in charge of Morty and Summer, and rather than keeping the house calm and orderly, he and Summer throw an enormous, chaotic party that spirals completely out of Rick's control. The guest list at this party reveals just how deeply substance use and reckless behavior are already woven into Rick's social world by the end of the show's very first season. Background appearances include 2 members of the Council Council of Ricks, despite Rick's already established disdain for that entire organization, along with Bird Person, Squanchy, Slow Mobius, and a strange hybrid creature named Abradolf Linkler, created by Rick by combining the genetic material of two very different historical figures in a failed attempt to build a morally neutral leader. At one point during the party, Morty throws a bag of Rick's crystals out of the house in frustration, only for a strange, tentacled creature to grab the bag and later appear tripping uncontrollably in the background of a later scene. A small visual gag that treats accidental drug exposure as just another background detail of Rick's chaotic world, rather than anything requiring explanation. Despite the wreckage and chaos surrounding the party, the episode closes on an unexpectedly tender note. As the party rages on and time itself is shown frozen around them, Rick, Morty, and Summer share a quiet, genuinely joyful montage together, dancing and laughing without any of the tension, manipulation, or distance that usually defines Rick's interactions with his family elsewhere in the show. This detail matters because it reveals something uncomfortable about the conditions under which Rick allows himself to feel close to the people he loves. Rather than finding this closeness during a calm, sober moment, it arrives specifically during a scene defined by substance-fueled chaos, suggesting that even his rare moments of open affection remain tangled up with the same environment of intoxication and recklessness that defines nearly everything else about him. The choice to end the entire first season on this exact image, a house destroyed by a party built around drinking and drugs, followed immediately by one of the only unguarded, happy family moments shown up to that point, signals just how central substance use already was to the show's understanding of its own main character, even this early in its run. This drinking habit connects directly back to Rick's decades-long hunt for Rick Prime, the man responsible for killing Diane and Beth. As that search dragged on with no resolution in sight, Rick's mental state grew worse over time, and he began drinking heavily as a direct response to the mounting frustration and grief of failing year after year to find the one person responsible for destroying his family. Alcohol became a tool for managing an emotional weight that Rick refused to address through any other, more direct method, fitting the exact same pattern already seen in every other part of his life. Rather than process pain, he found a substance that let him avoid feeling it as sharply. One of the clearest and most serious depictions of what this coping mechanism actually costs Rick emotionally comes from an episode called Autoerotic Assimilation, the third episode of Season 2. In this episode, Rick reconnects with a former partner named Unity, a hive mind entity capable of controlling and connecting the population of an entire planet at once. Unity and Rick clearly share real history together, and their reunion, at least at first, seems to bring Rick genuine happiness, something rarely shown so plainly across the rest of the series. This same episode also confirms directly that Rick identifies as pansexual, a detail the show treats with the same casual, unbothered tone it applies to most other aspects of Rick's personal life, folding it naturally into his history with Unity rather than treating it as a dramatic reveal. During their reunion, Unity uses its ability to control every person on the planet to organize an enormous celebration specifically in Rick's honor, assimilating the local population into one large, coordinated party built entirely around making him happy. This same power, however, reveals its darker side almost immediately. At one point, Unity destroys an entire city seemingly for entertainment, without pausing to check whether the area was actually empty first. Rick reacts with genuine horror at this destruction, uncertain whether Morty and Summer might have been caught somewhere inside the blast at the time, a moment that briefly interrupts the episode's otherwise nostalgic, romantic tone with a stark reminder of exactly how dangerous this relationship really is, even during what is supposed to be one of its happiest stretches. During their time together, Unity makes an important observation about a society completely under its control. Speaking through the body of an older woman early in the episode, Unity explains that recreational substances had been phased out entirely across the population it controls, since there is no need to escape from yourself when your entire world already exists as one unified whole. This line matters because it directly connects substance use to the specific act of escaping the self, a connection that applies with painful accuracy to Rick's own habits throughout the rest of the show. Unity does not need alcohol or drugs because Unity does not experience the same kind of internal division or private pain that drives someone like Rick to reach for a bottle in the first place. Rick's own reason for staying connected to Unity, even after years apart, hints at something deeper than simple romantic attraction. When Unity questions why Rick has reconnected with his family after all this time, he offers only a vague answer, suggesting it might be part of getting older, or perhaps that he missed the specific feeling of being
being with a collective, a way of being connected to something larger than himself without the risks that come with ordinary, individual relationships. Even this connection, though, comes with its own dangers. Rick's granddaughter Summer eventually tells both Rick and Unity directly that their relationship is toxic, pointing out that being together only seems to bring out the worst traits in each of them rather than anything healthy or stable.
The relationship ends exactly the way most of Rick's relationships end throughout the series. Unity ultimately decides they cannot stay together, leaving Rick behind along with the rest of the planet's population and departing for good, leaving only a written note explaining that while their time together was enjoyable, a real, lasting relationship between them is not possible. This loss affects Rick in a way the show rarely allows itself to depict so plainly. Rather than shrugging it off with a joke, Rick is shown genuinely devastated by being left behind again, upset enough that he is shown crying, one of the only moments across the entire series where his sadness is presented without any comedic distance softening it. What follows this heartbreak is one of the darkest moments the show has ever depicted involving Rick directly. After Unity leaves for the final time, and after separately agreeing to Beth's request that he stop keeping live alien creatures inside the family garage without putting up a fight, Rick is shown attempting to take his own life using a laser device he has built. He survives only because he loses consciousness beforehand, causing his head to fall out of the laser's path at the very last moment, an outcome the show frames as accidental rather than intentional. This moment is handled with a noticeably quieter, more serious tone than the rest of the episode, standing in sharp contrast to the humor surrounding almost everything else happening around it. This is sensitive material, and it deserves to be handled carefully rather than glossed over or played for shock value within the video itself. The moment exists in the show as a serious, canon-confirmed depiction of a character reaching what the story presents as his lowest point across the first 2 seasons, directly following the loss of one of the only relationships that ever seemed to offer him something close to real connection. Treating it with the same weight the show itself gives it, rather than turning it into another piece of dark comedy, matters if the goal is to accurately represent what this moment says about Rick's internal state at that point in his story. Looking at this moment alongside everything already covered about Rick's drinking, a clearer picture starts to form. Alcohol is not simply a running joke woven into his character for comedic flavor. It exists as one part of a much larger pattern of avoidance that runs through nearly every relationship and every loss shown throughout the series. Rick drinks heavily after failing for years to find Rick Prime. He drinks steadily throughout ordinary days without any specific trigger shown on screen at all, and in his lowest, most exposed moment following Unity's departure, the show ties his devastation directly to an act of near total self-destruction, framing his emotional pain as something that nearly ended his life entirely, almost by accident, in a moment with no audience, no witnesses, and no dramatic music swelling underneath it. This detail also reframes something explored earlier regarding Rick's physical appearance. His grayish, unhealthy skin tone, confirmed directly by the show's own visual choices to be tied to his heavy drinking, is not simply a stylistic detail meant to make him look more like a mad scientist. It is a visible, physical marker of years spent numbing himself against pain he has never fully processed, worn openly on his body in a way none of his other coping mechanisms, from revenge to isolation to elaborate escape schemes, ever managed to reveal quite so plainly. The effects of this pattern extend beyond Rick's own body and reach directly into how the rest of the household functions day to day. Looking closely at the family's overall communication style, the Smith household consistently shows a pattern where Rick maintains high visibility and constant presence in his grandchildren's lives while holding very little real authority accountable to consequences, largely because no one else in the house is positioned to check his behavior effectively. Rick regularly encourages Morty to skip school entirely in favor of adventures, and consistently undermines Jerry's attempts to act as a stabilizing father figure for Summer and Morty, reinforcing his own central role in the household at the direct expense of ordinary structure and routine. This household pattern did not develop separately from Rick's drinking. It grew directly alongside it. Since a household organized around accommodating one adult's constant intoxication and unpredictable behavior naturally ends up reshaping itself around managing that behavior, rather than enforcing consistent, healthy boundaries for the children living inside it. Alcohol, in this sense, functions as the quietest and most constant version of everything already explored across every other section of this story. Turning into a pickle to avoid therapy requires an elaborate one-time scheme. Hunting Rick Prime across the multiverse requires decades of planning and travel. Splitting himself in two using an alien machine requires an entire vacation built around a single strange treatment. Drinking requires none of that. It sits quietly in Rick's pocket, available
available at any moment, in any scene, offering the same basic function every single day, without needing any special circumstance to justify reaching for it. Long after the pickle stunt fades into memory, long after Rick Prime is finally dead, the flask remains, still present, still doing the same work it has clearly been doing for decades. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This constant, everyday presence of alcohol throughout Rick's life stands in sharp contrast to the much rarer moments where Rick allows himself to be vulnerable with another person directly, without a bottle, a weapon, or an elaborate escape plan standing between himself and whoever he is with. One of these rare moments came at a point in the story where Rick had to make a choice that risked everything, not to avoid his family's pain, but specifically to protect them from consequences that were entirely his own fault to begin with. Section 9. The one time Rick let someone in. Throughout nearly every part of his story, Rick Sanchez avoids vulnerability using elaborate schemes, revenge missions, alcohol, and outright denial. Then, at the end of Season 2, something happens that looks, on the surface, like the exact opposite of everything Rick usually does. He appears to sacrifice his own freedom specifically to protect the people he loves. Looking closely at what actually happens across the two episodes connected to this moment reveals something far more complicated than a simple story about Rick finally opening his heart. This story begins at the end of an episode already covered earlier in this video, The Wedding Squanchers, where Bird Person is killed at his own wedding after Tammy reveals herself as an undercover Galactic Federation agent. In the chaos following his death, Rick and the rest of the Smith family become wanted fugitives, forced to flee Earth entirely since the Federation is now actively hunting them. They spend time hiding on a remote, isolated planet, drifting from place to place while searching for somewhere far enough from Federation reach to stay safe. During this period, while hiding beneath the floor of a small house without anyone realizing he could hear them, Rick overhears a difficult conversation among the rest of the family. Jerry suggests that everyone should return to Earth and turn Rick in to the authorities, arguing that Rick's selfish behavior is the reason the entire family is now in danger. The rest of the family disagrees, telling Jerry they want to stay by Rick's side no matter the risk, out of the kind of unconditional love families are supposed to offer each other. Rick hears every word of this exchange from his hiding place beneath them. Shortly afterward, despite hearing his family choose him so directly, Rick decides on his own, without consulting anyone, that turning himself into the Galactic Federation is the best way to protect his family's safety going forward. This choice looks, from the outside, like one of the clearest acts of selfless love Rick has ever shown across the entire series. He had just heard proof that his family wanted him around no matter what, and his response was to remove himself from their lives anyway, seemingly to spare them from a life spent running and hiding because of choices he made. The following season premiere, an episode called The Rick Shank Redemption, picks up with Rick already imprisoned by the Federation, undergoing interrogation as agents attempt to extract the secret behind his portal gun technology directly from his memories. Rick spends much of the episode manipulating this interrogation process, eventually escaping by transferring his consciousness into the body of one of the guards sent to kill him, then using this access to infiltrate the citadel of Rick's and the Federation's own systems from the inside. Through a combination of technical sabotage and brute force, Rick manages to collapse the entire Galactic Federation, using stolen access to their financial systems to make their currency worthless, effectively destroying their economy and causing the organization to lose control of Earth entirely. Returning home as a hero in the eyes of Summer and Beth, Rick immediately gets caught up in a family conflict, as Jerry demands that Beth choose between keeping her father in the house or staying married to him. Beth chooses Rick, and Jerry ends up leaving the household as the two begin divorce proceedings. During the argument surrounding this decision, Morty, worked up and manipulated by circumstances Rick himself engineered, ends up shooting Rick directly in the chest. Rick survives the shot, and it is later revealed that the entire confrontation, including being shot by his own grandson, functioned as a deliberate test of loyalty that Rick had arranged, rather than something that happened to him by accident. Once the dust settles, Rick reveals the full truth to Morty directly. His decision to surrender himself to the Galactic Federation was never simply about protecting his family out of love. It was a calculated plan aimed at achieving two specific goals at once: taking revenge against the Galactic Federation itself and punishing Jerry specifically for suggesting, back during the earlier crisis, that the family should turn Rick in. By orchestrating Jerry's removal from the household through this same scheme, Rick also secured his own position as the primary adult figure in Morty's life going forward, ensuring that Morty would continue joining him on adventures without Jerry's influence getting in the way. This reveal completely reframes everything that came before it. What initially looked like one of the only truly selfless moments
moments in Rick's entire story turns out, according to Rick's own explanation, to have been calculated revenge dressed up to resemble sacrifice. He did not simply give himself up out of love for his family, accepting captivity and danger purely to spare them further hardship. He used the entire situation as an opportunity to punish someone who had wronged him, dismantle an organization he already despised, and secure his own influence over his grandson at the same time, all while allowing everyone around him to believe, at least for a while, that he had done something purely noble. This detail matters enormously when trying to understand exactly how deep Rick's numbness actually runs. Even in the one moment that most closely resembles genuine emotional vulnerability, the show itself pulls back the curtain to reveal calculation sitting underneath. Rick did not simply let his guard down because he loved his family enough to sacrifice his own comfort for their safety. He built an elaborate, multi-step plan that happened to result in something that looked like sacrifice from the outside, while actually serving his own interests in revenge and control the entire time. There is also a smaller detail worth examining closely: the choice to shoot Morty into confrontation as part of testing loyalty. Rather than simply asking Morty directly where his loyalty stood, or having an honest conversation about trust between them, Rick set up a scenario dangerous enough that Morty ended up shooting his own grandfather in the chest, all engineered specifically so Rick could evaluate the situation from a position of control rather than vulnerability. Even a moment involving something as serious as being shot by a family member becomes, in Rick's hands, another controlled experiment rather than an honest, unguarded interaction. Fans and critics who examine this episode closely have pointed out an interesting complication buried within all of this manipulation. Jerry, despite being framed as the villain of this particular storyline, was not entirely wrong in his original concerns. The Galactic Federation, once in control of Earth, was already shown turning the planet into something closer to a police state, exactly the kind of outcome Jerry claimed he was trying to avoid by suggesting the family turn Rick in during their earlier crisis. Jerry's willingness to hand Rick over to stop that outcome, even though it came from a place of self-interest and fear rather than pure principle, still lined up with a legitimate concern about where the Federation's control over Earth was heading. This detail does not excuse Jerry's decision, but it does complicate the idea that Rick's revenge against him was simply justice being served against someone acting purely out of malice. Looking at the entire sequence of events side by side, from the moment Rick overheard his family's loyalty beneath the floorboards, to his decision to surrender, to the eventual reveal of his true motivations, paints a picture very different from a simple story about Rick finally learning to love someone enough to sacrifice for them. Instead, it shows a man capable of using even the appearance of sacrifice as another tool for control, revenge, and self-interest, layering genuine risk and real consequences underneath motives that had almost nothing to do with pure, uncomplicated love. This does not mean Rick feels nothing for his family throughout this entire sequence of events. The show makes clear elsewhere that his attachment to Morty, in particular, runs deep enough to survive even a machine specifically designed to strip toxic traits out of his personality, as already explored earlier in this video. But feeling something for someone, and being capable of expressing that feeling honestly, without manipulation, calculation, or hidden motives layered underneath, are two very different things. Rick's actions throughout this entire storyline suggest that even when real affection exists somewhere underneath his choices, he remains almost constitutionally incapable of letting that affection stand on its own, without wrapping it inside a scheme built for his own benefit as well. This pattern connects directly back to nearly every other moment already explored across this entire story. Turning into a pickle rather than speaking honestly in therapy, abandoning a ruined world rather than facing the consequences of his own mistake, hunting Rick Prime for decades rather than processing his grief directly, splitting himself in two rather than confronting his own toxic traits honestly, drinking constantly rather than sitting with pain unmedicated. And now, even in a moment that briefly looked like pure sacrifice, revealing underneath it all a plan built around revenge and control rather than simple, honest vulnerability. Each of these moments, taken individually, might look like an exception to Rick's usual detachment. Taken together, they reveal detachment as the constant, unbroken rule running underneath every part of his story, no matter how convincing the surface appearance of change or growth might look in any single episode. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Understanding this pattern across every section already covered raises one final question. If Rick's entire life demonstrates such a consistent, unbroken commitment to avoiding real emotional emotional exposure, using every tool available to him, from science to violence to manipulation to alcohol. What, if anything, does his story actually offer anyone watching from the outside who recognizes even a small piece of this same pattern in themselves? Section 10. What Rick Sanchez actually teaches about surviving numbness. Rick Sanchez spent decades building nearly every possible defense against feeling anything directly. He turned into a pickle rather than sit through a single hour of family therapy. He abandoned an entire ruined world rather than face the consequences of his own mistake. He hunted one man across the multiverse for years rather than process a single devastating loss. He tried to physically split himself in two rather than carry his own flaws honestly. He drank steadily through nearly every stage of his life rather than sit with pain unmedicated. And even in the one moment that looked most like real sacrifice, the show revealed calculation and revenge sitting underneath it the entire time. Taken together, this pattern paints a portrait of someone who treats emotional avoidance not as an occasional lapse, but as his default operating method for handling almost everything difficult that happens to him. What makes Rick's story genuinely useful to examine, rather than simply a portrait of dysfunction, is what the show eventually does with all of this buildup. Rather than leaving Rick permanently frozen in the same patterns established across earlier seasons, more recent material confirms that some amount of real, measurable change eventually did take hold, even if that change came slowly, imperfectly, and without any single dramatic turning point resolving everything at once. This shift becomes visible starting in Season 6, in an episode called Analyze Piss. In that episode, Rick finally turns to Dr. Wong for genuine advice after growing exhausted with a constant stream of hostile strangers who treat picking fights with him as some kind of personal platform. For the first time in the show's history, Rick actually accepts the guidance he receives, choosing to ignore these provocations rather than engaging with every single one the way he normally would. This single decision marks a real behavioral shift from someone who, in earlier seasons, consistently chose escalation and confrontation over any form of restraint. The same episode continues building on this shift through a smaller, quieter storyline. After Jerry gets into a physical fight with a character known as Pissmaster, Rick overhears strangers at a bar discussing how much of a terrible person Pissmaster actually is. Rather than simply laughing this off or using it as another excuse for detachment, Rick finds himself genuinely relating to what he hears, recognizing uncomfortable pieces of his own reputation reflected back at him through someone else's story. When Rick later goes to share a six-pack of beer with Pissmaster, hoping to connect with him directly, he discovers that the man has already died by his own hand. Rather than treating this discovery with his usual detachment, Rick responds with what the show frames as genuine sympathy, going so far as to assume Pissmaster's identity afterward, specifically so the man could be remembered by others as something closer to a hero rather than simply another cautionary story. This moment matters because it shows Rick engaging with someone else's pain directly, choosing an act of quiet respect over mockery or indifference, something that would have been almost unthinkable for the version of Rick introduced across the earliest seasons of the show. It does not erase decades of avoidance built up before it, but it does confirm that something in Rick's default patterns had genuinely started shifting by this point in the series. This shift becomes even clearer in Season 7, in an episode called Air Force Wong, which aired on October 29, 2023, written by Alex Rubens and directed by Jacob Hare. The episode opens with Rick already sitting in an ongoing therapy session with Dr. Wong, the same therapist who first appeared confronting his avoidance years earlier during the events of Pickle Rick. This alone represents a significant change. Rather than treating a single mandatory family session as something to escape through elaborate schemes, Rick is shown attending regular sessions on his own, engaging with the same kind of process he once mocked outright as something only helpful for what he used to call an agent of averageness. The episode's plot brings back Unity, the hive mind entity Rick previously dated, last seen departing from his life during the events covered earlier in this video. Unity has taken control of the population of an entire American state, and initially, this looks like another act of aggression aimed at Rick. As the story unfolds, the actual explanation turns out to be far more personal. Unity came to Earth specifically to check on Rick, having grown genuinely concerned about him after losing contact. Once the immediate crisis is resolved, Rick discovers that Unity had left him several voicemail messages over time, each one expressing real concern about his well-being, messages Rick had never bothered to listen to or respond to at all. Rather than shrugging this discovery off the way earlier versions of Rick consistently handled similar moments, the episode shows him sitting with the weight of what he finds. Dr. Wong points out directly that Rick's own failure to to answer these calls mirrors exactly what Unity did to him years earlier when their relationship ended, drawing a clear, uncomfortable parallel between his past hurt and his present behavior towards someone reaching out with genuine care. The episode does not resolve this tension into some neat, tidy lesson learned. It simply presents the parallel honestly and lets it sit there, unresolved, the same way real emotional growth rarely arrives with clean, satisfying conclusions attached to it. By the end of the episode, even the President of the United States, a recurring character who frequently pulls Rick into chaotic missions, ends up deciding he needs therapy himself after witnessing enough of the fallout from Rick's own tangled relationships. Rick shares a round of drinks with him at the end of the episode, a quiet, almost throwaway scene that nonetheless closes out the story with something resembling genuine connection rather than another elaborate scheme or act of avoidance. Placed next to Dr. Wong's original assessment of Rick all the way back during the events of Pickle Rick, this later material completes a thread the show apparently intended to develop over a much longer stretch of time than most viewers may have initially realized. Dr. Wong's original point, made clearly during that very first confrontation, was that mental self-care deserves the same attention and effort most people give to physical health, and that manufacturing physical danger and risk is often just another way of avoiding the much harder, much less exciting work of facing emotional pain directly. Season 6 and Season 7 confirmed that this point eventually landed, at least partially, even if it took years of the show's own internal timeline for Rick to actually begin acting on it. None of this suggests Rick becomes a fully healed, fully transformed person by the end of these later seasons. He still initially ignored Unity's calls rather than answering them directly. He still needed an entire chaotic crisis involving a hive mind takeover of an American state before finally confronting what those unanswered messages actually meant. Real, lasting change rarely arrives all at once, and the show does not pretend otherwise. What it does show, clearly and consistently across multiple episodes spanning several seasons, is that someone capable of decades of avoidance, manipulation, and numbness can still take small, imperfect steps towards something healthier, provided they eventually stop running long enough to actually try. This is where Rick's story becomes genuinely useful to think about, beyond simply being an entertaining piece of television built around a brilliant, self-destructive scientist. Nearly everything covered across this video shows the same basic pattern repeating itself in different forms. Faced with pain, Rick consistently reaches for distraction, control, revenge, or detachment instead of direct emotional honesty. This pattern did not develop overnight, and it did not resolve overnight either. It built up slowly, through years of repeated choices, each one reinforcing the belief that feeling less was safer than feeling fully. And when change eventually did arrive, it arrived just as slowly, through equally small, unglamorous choices repeated over time. Actually showing up to a scheduled therapy session instead of turning into a pickle. Actually sitting with discomfort instead of manufacturing an elaborate crisis to distract from it. Actually listening to a voicemail left by someone who cared enough to check in, rather than letting it sit unheard indefinitely. None of this excuses the very real damage caused throughout Rick's story. Damage inflicted on people who loved him, people who trusted him, and people who simply happened to be standing nearby when his avoidance turned destructive. A pattern of numbness explaining where someone's behavior comes from is never the same thing as that pattern excusing the consequences of that behavior. Rick's family paid real costs throughout this story, from Bird Person's death to Jerry's manipulated divorce to years spent living under the weight of a man who rarely let anyone get close enough to actually help him. Understanding the roots of numbness does not erase what that numbness costs the people standing closest to it. What Rick's story ultimately offers is not a tidy formula for healing, and it never pretends to be one. It offers a long, honest look at what happens when someone consistently chooses avoidance over feeling, decade after decade, and what it eventually takes, even for someone this deeply entrenched in that pattern, to begin choosing something different instead. The change, when it finally comes, is neither dramatic nor complete. It shows up quietly, in a therapy chair instead of a garage lab, in a shared drink with an old friend instead of a scheme built for revenge, in the simple, difficult act of finally listening to a message someone left out of genuine care, long after it would have been easier to keep ignoring it entirely. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.